Welcome back to the ARKAST podcast where we talk to all of the podcast creators that are going to be coming to ARKAST. This is sort of a special episode. We're speaking to some of our main speakers and panelists that are going to be at the event on September 7th. And with me today is a special guest, Larry Roberts with Red Hat Media and the Branded Podcast. Larry, hey, how are you?
Great, man. I appreciate you having me here. This is awesome.
Absolutely, for sure. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, just surface level?
Yeah, man. I mean, at the very surface is with my Branded Podcast and my co-host of Branded, Sarah Losi. I launched Branded Podcast. We work with entrepreneurs and businesses to launch podcasts that are branded with their business brand or their personal brand and help them get their message out and help them grow their audience, grow their community, and establish their brand through the power of podcasting.
Amazing. And I'm sure that comes in useful. So you're talking to businesses about their branding, but I mean you yourself have to brand your own podcast, I'm sure. And like when I think of your podcast, I always think of, because I looked it up. There's several different branded, podcasts by
There's
name.
a couple.
You know what I mean? But,
Yeah.
Right. Because I tried to tag you the other day in a post, and I was like, "There's so many here," but yours stands out because I mean it's. The sticker, it looks like stickers to me. It looks like
it does look like stickers. Yes.
The word
yes.
branded stickers that are just sort of stacked up against each other. So it sticks in my mind because I'm a marketing person, and it was colorful and it was, it hit me in just the right way.
Sure.
So I guess, how did you get started on this whole journey of podcasting?
Dude, in all honesty, I mean, I started podcasting in 2014 and I started podcasting after coming out of rehab. I went into rehab in 2013 for alcohol. And when I came out in 14, I was like, oh, wow, this sober life is kind of interesting. What do I do? And, and I've always been a massive fight fan. My background is in martial arts. I used to own my own karate school and all that fun stuff. So MMA and all that fun stuff was at the forefront of my thought process with everything. And so a friend of mine goes, dude, you watch the UFC. You've always watched the UFC. So you know who Joe Rogan is. You got to check out this Joe Rogan podcast. And I'm like, dude, I don't have time for a podcast. I'm way too busy doing other things. But I eventually listened to the Joe Rogan podcast. And what happened is there were two comedians that were on there. It was Tony Hinchcliffe and Joey Diaz. And they're two very mainstream comedians right now. Tony Hinchcliffe actually has one of the most popular live podcasts in the world called Kill Tony right now. And I just fell in love with the medium, because I turned 51 in August. Okay. So I'll be 51 when I come there to ARKAST. And so I grew up in the 80s, and the comedy that I grew up with was a little more, well, we call it blue in the industry, but it's a little more aggressive maybe than some of the comedy we hear today. And actually, I'm seeing a resurgence. If you ever watch like Tom Segura or any of the mainstream cat daddies that are out there right now, Bert Kreischer, they're kind of reliving that 80s heyday of comedy, and it's very similar. But I heard Tony Hinchcliffe and I heard Joey Diaz, and I was like, oh my God, I can say those jokes on a podcast and not get in trouble. This is so cool. So I immediately reached out to a friend of mine who was an open micer here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And I said, dude, we got to start this podcast thing. And so we did. I bought the absolute worst mic you could possibly buy for a podcast. It was a Blue is the brand name, Blue Snowball. And it literally looks like a ball. It's white, so they call it a snowball. Yep. It's about the size of a softball. And not knowing anything, not knowing how to work a mic, not knowing any kind of etiquette with a mic, not knowing anything, myself and Jamie Gravitt, who is crushing it on the comedy scene right now, we sat there in my den right on the other side of the wall here, and we held that Yeti snowball in our hands, and we would whisper our first words, and we would say something about our podcast, and we gently hand that microphone off to one another. So we were sitting there literally cupping this Yeti snowball microphone back and forth, and that was my very first ever podcast. So we improved over time, and I jumped in there and I started figuring out exactly what makes a podcast. So I started consuming content from Cliff Ravenscraft and from Pat Flynn and from John Lee Dumas. These were all the cat daddies back in the day, and I started learning about the industry. And honestly, I think it was just by the content itself. the podcast grew, and it was literally, to this day, it was still my most popular podcast that I've ever had. We had thousands of downloads per episode. It was amazing. We took the show to a live stage show even, and over the years, that stage show evolved into an open mic here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And for several years, it was the largest comedy open mic in Dallas-Fort Worth outside of the comedy clubs. So we managed to dial in and find that audience. But again, I think a lot of it had to do with the content and just the timing. And podcasting was, although podcasting started back in, I just found out the other day, it was 2003. I always said it started in 2004, but apparently it was a little bit earlier than that.
Yeah.
But, we're 10 years into the game here. But even in 2014, podcasting was still pretty new. Not a lot of people were consuming podcasts on a regular basis, and people were just learning what that term was. So I think because of the timing, because of the content, it was just timing, and everything came together to make this podcast as amazing as it was. And we had a lot of success with that podcast. But at the same time, I was also in corporate America, and I had been with this company for X number of years, and they were even with me through all my rehab and all my nonsense that I put them through over the years. They stuck with me, and they finally called me in because even the innuendo of our, even the name of our show was an innuendo. So people were wearing our merch to work, and it just was not appropriate for a corporate environment. And I did get called into HR, and they're like, dude, either the show has to go or you got to pack your bags. It's just that simple. Yeah. So I ended up killing that show and starting another podcast. And I called it Readily Random at the time because I just wanted to talk to whoever. I had that Joe Rogan syndrome that a lot of podcasters have today, thinking they can talk to whoever they want to talk to. Mm-hmm. They can talk for as long as they want to talk. They can do whatever they want, and people are going to listen. But I found out the hard way that no one cares. I'm not Joe Rogan. I don't have that freedom to talk to whoever I want to. I need to find a niche. I need to find a focus, and I need to find a very specific audience. And it took me a couple of years to come to that realization, but eventually I did. But during that time, I'm not going to lie, dude, I had some killer conversations with a lot of people. I talked with NFL Hall of Famers. I talked with motivational speakers. I talked to actors. I talked to, and this is just a little insight into Lair, I do enjoy origami from time to time. Okay, don't judge me. But I actually got to talk to the premier origami artist in the United States. He's an MIT mathematics professor. And I learned that origami isn't just folding paper. There's a whole lot of really complex math that's involved there too. But no one cared. No one cared. Yeah. No one listened. No one tuned in. It was just me. And while I had a blast, I also had these delusions of grandeur. I wanted my show to go big time, but I didn't know how to do it. And I struggled and I struggled and I struggled. And then I finally realized, once I started getting involved in the podcast community, once I started going to events like ARKAST, I started going to Podfest, I started going to Podcast Movement, and I started going to local podcast meetups. I started understanding the medium. I started learning, here's what you have to do to find an audience and to establish your show. So that's what got me to where I'm at today.
Amazing. What was going to some of those like podcast movement and Podfest? What was that doing to you? What did it show you that disproved what you thought you believed in?
I mean, at first it was overwhelming. I mean, I think back in the very first conference I went to was a podcast movement. And it's interesting because I think back, and I think PM started, for those of us in the biz, PM is podcast movement. But I started thinking back, and I think the first podcast movement, I believe, was in 2014. And since I'm in Dallas and that organization started in Dallas, I remember hearing about it. And I'm like, dude, I don't need some stupid conference. I don't need to go and hang out with these freaking podcast nerds to figure out what's up. I got it. I'm good. But once I humbled myself and once I went, I was like, oh my God. It was so eye-opening because there's so much to it that you don't know. So many times, and especially over the last few years, we saw the COVID creator really jump out because what are we going to do? We're all stuck at home. Well, let's start a podcast. And people are under the assumption that they can just start this podcast, do whatever they want to do, and it's going to grow. But that's just not the case. And that's what I started seeing when I started going to these conferences. I started realizing that podcasts, they need to have a focus. They need to have a topic. They need to have a niche. They need to have an industry. And within that industry and that niche, audiences exist. So we have to tailor fit our content to reach the audience that's best fit for that content. And that's what I started seeing. I started seeing ways to streamline my creation process. I started to see ways of identifying my audience. I started understanding, how do I craft my podcast cover art? I mean, something as simple as that, that helps you get that attention on the podcast platforms. Something as
Mhm.
simple as learning how to stop the scroll with some really cool cover art, that makes all the difference in the world. And I started seeing all the details and all the intricacies that go into understanding how to build and understanding how to grow a podcast.
That's amazing. That's yeah. So you took the lessons that you learned there, and it sort of changed what you were doing with your own podcast. And so, did you continue on with that format, or did you start a new show, or how did you what did you do with that?
No, it's interesting. I did for a while. I kept on with Readily Random
Yeah.
because I'm pretty
Okay.
hard headed, and I'm pretty determined. This is the way it's
Yeah.
going to work.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
in all honesty, it did start to grow. It started to grow a little bit. And if I had stuck with Readily Random, it probably would have continued to grow, but
Okay.
at a much slower pace than what was working for me, because I started seeing too that all these people were making money from their podcast. All these people were leaving these careers that they had and doing podcasting full time. And I'm like, man, I love this so much. I would love to do it full time. So how do I do that? And a lot of people, they want to monetize their shows, but so many times people that want to monetize their shows, they also want to monetize it directly. And that is an extremely difficult thing to do,
Yeah.
but it's much, much easier to monetize your podcast indirectly, meaning
Mhm.
you use your podcast to establish your professionalism or your expertise in a particular niche, in a particular industry. And then you leverage that to do things like, well, write a book or write a course or start speaking or start teaching. There's all
Mhm.
these other avenues that open up for you once you have that podcast. And a lot of people think, man, I need all these thousands and thousands of downloads. And especially today, that's extremely, I'll say it again, extremely difficult to do.
Yeah.
The average podcast right now pulls down about 125 downloads per episode. And everybody else has these tens of thousands of downloads, delusions of grandeur that just don't happen. But that doesn't mean you can't monetize your show. So I had to learn that as well. I had to learn how to indirectly monetize my podcast. And my podcast opened doors for me to start speaking. And then I started speaking on these little virtual events, small virtual events where
Mhm.
literally nobody showed up. Most of these virtual events that I spoke at,
Yeah.
they took place on a Saturday or a Sunday morning most of the time, and
Mhm.
most of them they were live streamed on Facebook. And I don't know if you've ever been live on Facebook, but if you look in that top left hand corner when you're live on Facebook, you can see
Right.
how many people are there, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
99% of the time, I looked up there and I saw the goose egg, and that
Yeah.
sucked. But what sucked even more is when I saw that one pop up every once in a while, and then they dropped off, and I was like, "Oh my
Yeah.
god, what did I say? Why didn't
Right.
they stay?" But that's the kind of shows that I started speaking on, and of course, I'm speaking for free. I'm giving
Mhm.
my time, but I'm putting as much effort and as much insight into those talks as I do today when I get paid to get on stage. But it was a progression, it was time. I built that business, I built that credibility, I built that opportunity, and I built it all through my podcast. I wouldn't be speaking today on stages if it wasn't for the podcast. I wouldn't know how to get on a microphone and convey a message if it wasn't for the podcast. Now, granted, I've invested a lot over the years too in Toastmasters, and I've taken voiceover lessons, and I've taken acting lessons, and I've taken speech classes, and I have two different speech coaches. So
Mhm.
I continue to invest in what I'm doing, but it all started with the podcast. And that's what so many people fail to see.
I was going to ask you about that because you have that natural radio type of voice. You know what I mean? So I didn't know if this is natural. You're like, I'm going to do a podcast. You just jumped on and automatically had the mic etiquette. You know what I mean? And no dead air in between, or if you it took time and practice.
It definitely took a lot of time to practice, and it still takes time. I mean, I'm literally, as soon as we get off this call, I have a coach that I'm meeting with. It's my coach.
Okay.
I'm not coaching. My coach is coaching me at 2:00 Central Time as soon as we hang up from this call. So I still to this day invest in myself, and that's something that we have to do as well. But having that microphone, having that camera, having this forum, having even a small audience to get in front of helps me refine that message.
Absolutely. I think you brought up something that was something a lot of people who are getting into podcasting, who have an idea for podcasting, they don't really understand or grasp. They get that sort of fever to be an influencer, and they think that the podcast is going to be the one thing that makes them shoot over the moon, and they're going to make all the money they need, and then that's going to launch them into something else. But you made a great point about using it as a tool, not necessarily like a stepping stone, but like it's something that you use to amplify your voice, building up your own personal brand, and then you can build that out into, like you said, speaking engagements, or to use it to gain clients, whatever I like that episode where you were talking about the ROI. I don't know if you coined that or not, but I've been using it ever since. I've talked to people, I'm like, that's genius. It's so genius. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a return on your investment, right? It's a return on your influence. And I wish I could take credit. I did not coin that term. And off the top of my head, I don't remember where I got it, but it wasn't me. I'm not that sharp. But it's amazing.
Here.
Yeah. It is amazing. It is your return on influence. And that's the same thing with everything that we do. As content creators, that return on influence doesn't just come from our podcast, but it comes from our social media. It comes from our blogs. It comes from our website. It comes from our interactions on a daily basis, because I'll tell you too, that while I'm lucky enough to be in a Metroplex area, I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I have access to a bunch of massive networking associations and networks. Kind of hard to say networking network, but anyways, that's what it is. But I get out there and I still shake hands. I still kiss babies. I still go out there and I get in the masses, and I awkwardly, because it's still, even for me, still awkward to go to these networking events where there's a room of 100 people and you don't know anybody, but it still opens that door. And once they find out you have a podcast, they go, oh, really? Oh, what's that about? And they want to know your area of expertise, and that opens that conversation. And from that conversation, who knows what's going to come from that? Opportunities to do business with this new person you just met could come around. Opportunities to be on their podcast, because we all know pretty much everybody has a podcast, right? And if they don't, they need one, right? So it opens up so many doors just to have that podcast. And, it's gotten to the point too, where I see people, they go, God, I don't want a podcast because it's just a meme. Everybody's got a podcast. Okay. Well, memes are based on reality. Okay. And the fact of the matter is, in this particular instance, I don't mind being a meme. I don't mind it at all, because it opens doors. And that is the biggest struggle that each and every one of us have when we're trying to build our influence or build our brand or build our business. It's opening those doors. And if this simple little podcast that gets 10 downloads an episode, who cares? It opens doors. And I use that number because it's not uncommon, especially for new podcasters, to get 10 downloads per episode. But that's not something that you look at and you scoff at. That's not something you look at and be disappointed in or be embarrassed about. Now, I wouldn't go bragging about it, but at the same time, I would leverage it. You know what I mean? Because you're still getting downloads. Somebody other than mom and dad are listening to your content. And that means that it has value for somebody. And even if you're standing in a room, I know this is a cheesy analogy that people use all the time, but if I'm getting, say, 25, if I get 25 downloads for an episode, I go, God, nobody's listening to my podcast. But if I stood in a room of 25 people and I had to stand in front of them and talk, would I not be scared to death? Would I not have to swallow hard and find that courage to even have that conversation with 25 people at the same time? I'm sure you would. I mean, I speak to hundreds, if not thousands of people from the stage right now. And I promise you, every time I get on that stage, it's a fight. It is a battle. And it's crazy because, and I just coined this term. It hasn't been 2 months since I was telling one of my coaches, I go, you know what? When I speak, because over the last probably 12 to 18 months, my speaking career has really kind of blown up, and I speak to larger audiences and bigger audiences. And I find myself in front of people that really just intimidate the daylights out of me. And it reminds me, and I mentioned my martial arts background, it reminds me of when I would actually go to fight. And before I did MMA back in the 90s, and before it was super cool. And before I would get in the cage, it was so freaking scary. It was the scariest time of my life. But right now, the scariest time of my life is before I go on stage to talk to a big audience. So it's no different than going into the cage than it is going on stage. So the coach that I was talking to, he goes, dude, you got to use that. You went from cage to stage, but it feels the exact same way. It's just as scary. Because as cheesy as it sounds, back in the day, I wasn't necessarily scared of the fight. I was scared of losing. I was scared of embarrassing myself. I was scared of letting my coaches down. I was scared of my homeboys making fun of me when I come out the cage after get my backside whooped. And it's the same thing when I step on stage. I'm scared of flubbing my words. I'm scared of not getting my message across. I'm scared of forgetting, oh, what was I going to say on this slide? So it's very, very similar. So you as a podcaster, you have that opportunity to talk to 10, 25, 50, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people, and you get to do it from the comfort of your own home or from the comfort of a professional studio if you're lucky enough to record in a studio. But as independent podcasters, most of the time, we're not allowed to record in these big studios because we can't afford it. And even me right now, this is my house. I'm in my house. I'm not in a professional studio. Now, granted, I built this out as a studio, but keep in mind, we're coming up on 10 years that I've been doing this gig too. So I built up to this. So my message to the independent podcaster that's out there, don't worry about who you're talking to or how many you're talking to. Just keep talking and it'll build for you.
Absolutely. Sage advice. I mean, it was great.
Can we just record that and just play it at ARKAST? I mean, because
for sure,
I was in the zone there for a minute. Sorry, bro.
You were. No, that's great. No. You poured out a lot, and I want you to save some. Hold back on some of this. You know what I mean?
Sorry,
we'll let you
man.
speak on stage.
I'm just giving it all. I'm giving it all.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm sure that there's plenty to learn from that. So you sort of you named or gave yourself a name as sort of an AI expert as well. On some of the news stations, and I've seen that you've been doing interviews with that and going on and talking about the tech. It's a hot topic issue right now, especially with so many different industries that are afraid of being replaced by it. I sort of think of it as you remember the Tim Burton's Willy Wonka movie back in the 2000s where the dad was replaced at the toothpaste cap company, you know what I mean? That's what he did. He made the caps and put them on the toothpaste things. And then they had the machine that came in and it automatically started doing it. And it got him out of a job. But then eventually he figured out that he could be a technician for that machine and then got his job, got a new job back,
100%.
So I kind of see that as how we deal with AI. Have you been using it with your podcasting at all, whether with the marketing or okay.
Yeah, no, I use it all the time. I literally use it all of the time. Right now, I'm probably subscribed to 4 or 5 different services that are AI that do various things. And AI is something that allowed me to really get on alternate stages outside of the podcast space too. And people go, dude, you're just talking about podcasting. Now you're supposed to be this AI guru kind of guy. How did that work? Well, my corporate background, and a lot of people don't know this because they only know me from the podcast space, but my corporate background, I was a business intelligence analyst. And I was in IT the whole time. So data and predictive analytics and that sort of thing, programming, that's all my background. So it wasn't that I saw this opportunity when ChatGPT went live back in November to go, oh, this is cool. This is something that I've been involved with for the vast majority of my career. I've got 20 years experience in an IT field, and when this came out, I did see the opportunity to go, oh my God, this is exactly what we need. AI is something that can help streamline the process for the independent podcaster, because
Mhm.
what we do, podcasting, and a lot of people, they stumble into this. They go, I'm going to start a podcast. And then they start the podcast and they realize, oh my God, this is a ton of work. I got to research my guests. I got to prep the episode. I got to record. I got to edit. I got to market. I got to do graphics. I got to do this social media nonsense. And it's a freaking job. So what
Yes.
AI has done is opened up an opportunity for the independent podcaster to get more of that work done in a shorter amount of time. Because most podcasters, especially the independent podcaster, they got a full-time job. Most of them have a full-time family. So you got a family, you have a career. Now you're trying to grow this podcast. Well, AI has opened up the opportunity to streamline a lot of that and take some of that workload off. And that was one of the biggest things that I saw when ChatGPT broke on the scene. And I was just lucky. I really did get lucky in the fact that I speak at Podfest and I co-promote Podfest. It's the
Mhm.
largest independent podcasters conference in the world. Literally, we have Guinness World Records that we set for largest virtual podcasting conference over the span of a week. Over 6,000 people in attendance, unique visitors. So, I mean, it's a massive conference for independent podcasters. And I had the opportunity this past January to talk about ChatGPT from the stage. So
Wow.
ChatGPT's been out 8 weeks, if that, 7, 8 weeks at the time. And I happen to be the guy that got to talk about it first in the podcast space. So from a timing perspective, yeah, it was ideal. It was perfect. And I was very lucky and very blessed to have that opportunity to be the first one to come out at a massive conference and have that
Mhm.
discussion. So
Right.
people in the audience saw that. People in the audience were kind of blown away. It was one of the, yeah, if I was going to say, it's one of the better talks that I've given. So, it was just, it just worked. It worked really well across every perspective. So timing was there, delivery was there, and just all the stars lined up for it to be great. And it established me as a leader, or a thought leader at least, in the
Sure.
podcast AI space, and that's opened up tremendous doors throughout the year.
That's amazing. So what all would you suggest, somebody that's starting out in podcasting, what would you suggest that they start implementing with AI? If they're familiar with Chat GPT, that's the big one, right? But there are plenty of others.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different platforms that are out there. There's Capshow and ChatGPT. Capshow's amazing. I
Mhm.
happen to know the developer of Capshow, Deidre Shin. She's
Okay.
amazing. So I don't have any affiliate links or anything like that. She's just a great person, and the software is next level. It's really awesome. Cast Magic is another amazing platform that's great as well. That will help you. You can upload your episodes. It'll transcribe your episodes. It'll write show notes for you. It'll give you options for show titles. It'll do a lot of the thinking that we typically have to do for you. So instead of having to spend time on going, man, how can I develop an SEO rich title for this episode? How can I
Sure.
develop SEO rich show notes for this episode? How can I publish this episode and make sure that when the web crawlers are out there, they come across my episode for these keywords and these key phrases that are relevant to the topic, so that if somebody's searching for a topic, my episode gets served up. It does all that for you. And that is so beneficial, especially for the person that, once again, has a full-time job, has a full-time family, that is really trying to do their best for their podcast. So leveraging these tools, I can't recommend it enough. And I wish these tools had been around back in 2014. It would have been amazing. So regardless of what the tool is right now, I don't know of any tools that are quote unquote bad. They offer different functionality. They have, some have
Mhm.
features that others don't have, and vice versa. So
Sure.
find a tool that fits within your budget, that works for you, and start leveraging it. But you were talking about the Willy Wonka gig and dad being replaced, and people right
Yes.
now, they're scared to death of being replaced by
Mhm.
AI.
They are.
And Gary Vaynerchuk, he
Yeah.
coined it, and he said it better than anybody. It's not going to be AI that replaces people. It's going to be people that understand how to use AI that's going to replace people. So we owe it to ourselves to not run from this technology, not hide from the technology, but to embrace the technology, understand it at least to the point that we can use it from a functional perspective. You don't have to know how to write code. You don't have to know how to write your own chatbot application or any of that nonsense, but understand what's there in your industry and your niche and understand how to use it to your advantage. And honestly, you're kind of selling yourself short if you don't right now, because I promise you, similar podcasts and your competitors, they're all using it.
For sure. And I think it's funny. It's such a hot topic, that it's just an easy thing for, Hollywood to use as a plot device, to be the
Sure.
main, the main
Well, it's all fun and games
antagonist.
till the Terminators get here, right? I mean,
Right. And so, yeah, we're all familiar with it. Like, it's made a come around because it's such a hot topic. So now we have Mission Impossible, Fast and Furious, like all of the latest ones that have come out this past summer, like they have all just been like the bad guy is AI.
of course.
Um, just to feed the fear, and it's just an easy one to draw on people. But you're saying, don't get caught up in that, because this is a tool that we could absolutely use. It's not Skynet.
No, it's not Skynet at all. And there's a huge difference. And the mainstream media, they don't really tell us this. There's a big difference between the
Yeah.
generative AI that we as content creators are using and the AGI, which is kind of the scary stuff. It's the artificial general intelligence that is kind of self-learning. That's the Skynet type stuff that we really need to be concerned about. But this generative stuff that helps us, establish a blog post or write show notes, that stuff's just amazing, and it helps us. And I just spoke in Florida about this a couple of weeks ago. I think it was last week, where people are like, "Oh my God, it's really going to replace me as a copywriter," and it's really not, because while we can fine tune ChatGPT and we can have it talking in our voice to a certain degree, it's still not us. It still doesn't have that real human emotion. So what I coach people on when it comes to using AI is you just use it as a starting point. Everything, honestly, everything, and maybe I'm exposing myself here. Everything I do, I start with ChatGPT, and
Mhm.
I've fine tuned a chat within ChatGPT, and now you've got some standard instructions that you can actually populate in ChatGPT as well that
Yeah.
establishes the baseline for your conversations. Some custom instructions is what they call it. But I actually took a chat and I fine tuned it to the voice of, okay, here we go. I'm giving away everything. I said, combine the voice of Gary Vee, Alex Hormozy, and Grant Cardone. Okay, so combine their three voices and rewrite whatever I write in their combined voice. And I mean, it kind of sounds like me. I do tend to use a
Mhm.
little profanity from time to time. I do think I'm still 25 instead of 51. So I do try to speak with a little slang. I try to just
Yeah.
connect to a younger demographic. I mean, hell, we're not going to get into it, but that's how the red hat was born, honestly. But I use that, and then I take it in. It's a little too wacky. I mean, it's a little too Gary
Sure.
Vee-ish. So I just take that, though, and I change a few words. I change a few sentences and just update it a little bit to my real voice. And then I use that. But you have to understand how much time that saves me, how much
Yeah.
inspiration that gives
Mhm.
me. I go, oh, cool, this is great. And then I just kind of, the keyboard just starts, I just light it up and we go to.
Right.
So that's what these AI tools, man, these
Yeah.
AI tools are for. They're not the answer. They're just direction. So
Mhm.
leverage them and take advantage of the opportunity to streamline what you're doing.
Absolutely. Larry, we were looking forward to having you here, at ARKAST is September 7th. Is this gonna be your first time in Arkansas, or
Dude,
have you been here
totally.
before?
Yes, it's so crazy
Yeah.
because I grew up in Texas. I mean, I'm from Texas. I was born
Right.
in Denison, Texas, which is right on the border of Texas and
Sure.
Oklahoma. And I'm right there. And, Arkansas is not that far away from
Right.
where I was born, but I have never, ever been to Arkansas. So when you and I connected, I was like, oh, okay,
Mhm.
well, this will be cool. I get to go to a new state. So I'm super stoked about it.
It's awesome. A great foreign land for you to explore.
We'll
I
see,
just,
man.
I'm from Texas too, and it's Tyler, what I mean, and
Okay, yeah.
I went back down to Houston to record a podcast this past weekend, and yeah, it's a different world, but I mean, it's going to be fun, And something you said earlier about, how it's sort of a meme that everybody has a podcast, and I think that's how some people feel about that. Here, it's not so much because everybody has a podcast; it's because it's still it's a newer industry to this state. and we haven't quite grasped our relationship with it or how to use it, how to consume it. It's like when streaming started coming through, you know what I mean, versus,
Yeah.
your Comcast, um, we're still at that level right now to where there are quite a few people who have a podcast. I think we've collected in our database over 200 shows that are being produced in Arkansas right now.
Nice.
But that's just across the state, you know what I mean? And we're discovering more as we keep going, because not everybody's great about marketing it or, putting it out there. So we're collecting those all the time. But it's still it's a new media here, and there are a few people who see it as it's a craze, like a blog, you know what I mean? It's like, well, podcasting was around back then it went away, then we went to blogging, and now it's back. And it's like, no, it never really went away. And
Right.
I remember in 2003, whenever podcasting started, when you had to download an MP3 off of somebody's website and then load it up
Yeah.
on your
Yep.
your pod player. And yeah, it's grown exponentially, but like we're getting more comfortable with the feel, especially because of ARKAST. I think it introduces it back into the state, and so, oh, this is an industry built around it. And so having expertise from professionals like yourself come in from out of state to be able to show, it's probably just it's something you deal with every day, and it's so common, but it's knowledge that we need to spread around here, and give that education piece about what can you do with podcasting, what is it used for, how do we do it,
Yeah.
so I'm really grateful for you to be able to come here and be able to speak for us.
Dude, super excited about it. I
Yeah.
honestly, I can't wait. Yeah, it's gonna be a fun one.
So absolutely. Larry, if somebody wants to follow you, because I'm sure that they do, where can they do that?
Yeah, man, I'm on every platform out there, typically as the Larry Roberts. So if you go on any social media platform, look for the Larry Roberts, you'll find me. Or you can head over to redhatmedia.io, and that's my website, and you can reach out to me there. I've got my calendar there. If you have some questions or concerns about your podcast, please jump on my calendar. I would love to talk to you about your podcast or your AI needs. Either one, man. Just reach out. Love to connect.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you, Larry, again.
The ARKAST podcast is brought to you by the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative. ARKAST is the Arkansas Podcast Festival, and it is going to be happening throughout September. That's right, September 1st through the 6th, we'll be hosting free workshops across Central Arkansas, and on September 7th, we will have the main event of ARKAST 2023 at the Innovation Hub once again. On September 20th, we're taking the festival on the road to Northwest Arkansas, where we will be hosting a podcast workshop at the Fayetteville Library, and the next day will be our very first annual ARKAST NWA. Tickets, reservations, and sponsorships are available at arkansaspodcasters.org.